Okay, today's Tanya, which ends the epistle, I think epistle 9. It's a misprint here, right? Because it says 7, that's not 7 for sure. It's either 8 or 9. Whatever. It's the end of the letter, the communal letter. And
question upstairs.
Nikki's around me. Good morning. Our first internet viewer. We have someone in person, though. Okay, so today's Tanya, which ends, again, I wish I had the Tanya in front of me that wasn't with a misprint, epistle 8 or 9. It's fine. The daily Tanya, I'm guessing it's 9 because, we're ending epistle 9. The Alter Rebbe for the past few weeks in the daily Tanya, which we're covering the fourth section of the Tanya, are predominantly, they're all letters, communal letters that he wrote, communal or private letters that he wrote. These letters are worthy of study because they're all very, very erudite references or ideas developed about different Jewish topics. But the main thrust of most of the letters, they are fundraising communal letters. And each letter was a different time in his tenure, between, 70 something and 1812. And he gives a different angle of why you should give charity. And the angle we went with in this letter, if I recall, was when you give a little bit of charity, that is analogous to planting a seed. You plant an apple seed, and what happens? You plant an apple seed, and it becomes a huge apple tree. How does a tiny seed be developed into a tree? And very short is because the seed is only a catalyst it's a switch to set into motion a much bigger process where the vegetative power of the earth starts to give all its minerals and whatever to develop the trunk and the branches and the roots, plus the sunlight, the water. But that seed was a necessary first step. So too, when you give charity, you're switching on a switch to bring divine revelation into your prayer.
Wow.
Because prayer is when you meet Hashem, right? I forgot if that was the past letter or the other letter. Regardless, he ends off with a very practical note. The very practical note was, pass that chitas there, because I may be making a mistake. I'm sorry. But he's going to end now with a very practical appeal. But this even practical appeal is gold, because it's telling you an insight to Jewish history, which we view, in many ways, Jewish history we view as a body, or history in general. That it starts with, right, the body, the flow of the soul goes through the brain to the mind then goes to directs the limbs, from the higher limbs to the lower limbs, and so on. Okay, one second. I made a mistake. It was a different letter yesterday. I take it back. What I said before was about the letter before. This letter is ending off a very short one. He's basically asking. He saw that the Hasidic Brotherhood were poor. They didn't have money, and therefore they couldn't give charity generously. But he says, despite all your economic hardships, which I totally empathize with, don't cheat yourself out. Don't cheat your souls out of the opportunity of giving charity when it hurts. Because the idea of us giving charity is not only when it's to someone you like or when it's easy. It's even when it's very hard, because ultimately charity is where you are embodying the divine attribute through giving, and giving because it's not because it's any reason of I'm giving my family because I like my family. I'm giving because I have extra cash and it feels good to give. You're giving like God gives, which is unconditional with no expectation of reciprocity.
Wow.
So even when it hurts, you should give charity, and that's the way you're bringing the divine, the oneness. You're living it. And he brings down. It's actually funny because it's many times the Rebbe would talk about how the daily Tanya, Chumash, and Rambam. There's a lot of times they're different cycles. They're not like meant to be, in parallel. They're totally different cycles, different systems, but every day, has its portion of each of those. But when there's an obvious overlap, the Rebbe would point it out. So this is very obvious. Yesterday's parsha talked about charity, and it talked particularly of the laws of precedence in charity. So as a precedence, Rashi, we did it last week. The precedence was you first have to give your family. If your family members are poor, you have to give them. Then you give your neighbors. Then you give your countrymen, and so on. And as I mentioned, that only applies in Jewish law when we're talking apples to apples. Like you have to give your immediate family if they need bread and water, or bread, basic subsistence. But if you're giving you're buying a summer house for your family, and you're not giving your fellow Jews then bread and water in Israel, poor Jews in Israel, then you got, it doesn't go like that. You have to give them first. So he's basically talking to them very, very practically. They're very poor. It was hand to mouth in those days, and yet still he demanded to even charity because that's unconditional God, divine attribute to give. God creates and gives, and we create and give. He also pointed yesterday an interesting idea that giving tzaddikim of the generation precedes giving your family, which is a fast, because he was raising money for the Hasidic leaders, the tzaddikim, who took a group to Israel to live there. And which, in general, those years, you can only live in Israel dependent upon support from diaspora. But he says that tzaddikim are whatever. Anyways, he's trying to raise money for the Holy Land, for people in the Holy Land. So he ends off today. I am begging you, my brethren, direct your hearts to these words that are expressed very briefly, and I'll speak to you face to face at length when we see each other. How in these times, when the approaching footsteps of Mashiach are close upon us,
Amen.
Because again, history is in many ways parallels to the human body. The soul comes to the mind, heart, limbs, toenails, heels. We're at the end of this. We're at the end of this history before Mashiach.
Amen.
And that's what the term is called, the footsteps Mashiach, which also means the heels Mashiach. In many ways, we're at the lowest. The divine Shechina, God's presence, is in the most hidden in our generation vis-a-vis any previous generations. This is going back to 1800. Even by then, it was already low. And it says, and the sages say, Israel will be redeemed from exile only through charity. Now, in other words, he's saying, despite the hardship, this is the mitzvah of the hour, is charity. 1800 around, he's saying this. Right? How much more so now when we've gone through even greater divine concealment through modernity and everything in many ways, right? Anyways, here's a good question. If charity is the most important mitzvah, it brings redemption in the words of the sages, then why do you find the Talmud era, they predominantly focused on Torah study? Right? The sages did charitable acts, but that's not what they were known for. The sages of the Talmud, right? The highest, what do you call it? Aspiration. Value was Torah study. So you're telling, and by the way, there's certain pithy statements in the Talmud that tzedakah is equivalent to all the other mitzvahs in a certain way because it's so important, like we're saying here. And yet we're also saying that it says Talmud Torah study is the most important. So he says that was then. Every generation, you have to do all the mitzvahs you can. It's not either or, it's both. The question is, what is the main call of the hour according to the history we find, the time in history we find ourselves? In the mystical history, because think about the idea. Our sage of blessed memory did not say the study of Torah is equivalent to the performance of acts of loving kindness, except in their own days. When they said Torah study outweighs charity, was in those days. Because then the principal divine service of the time was study of Torah, which is at that time there was great scholars, Tanya, Mishnah scholars, Amarayim, Gemara scholars. However, in a time of history, years later, 1,000 years later, in a time when the approaching footsteps of Mashiach are close upon us, as we call it, the Sukkah of David has fallen. It means the Jewish people's edifice and God being enclosed, the Shekhinah, animating the Jewish people in exile. We're in a very low state. We're in exile. We're downtrodden and all that. We're downtrodden to a level of feet and heels, meaning to the level of Asiya, which in very short is the lowest of the worlds, meaning there's many worlds. And the question is, where is the Shekhinah shining at that moment, at that time in history? Well, the further you go down in history, the lower God's Shekhinah projection goes to lower. When we say lower, to greater concealment, and it gets into this it's primarily found. It's everywhere, but it's even going to the final bus stop, which is this physical, atheistic, independent-looking type of world.
All right.
There's no way of cleaving to the Shekhinah, meaning except how? And to transform the darkness. How do you reveal it? How do you reveal God in a godless society of today?
All right.
And outwardly, right? Except through a corresponding category of action. God's within action. The physical hides on the spiritual. So how do you reveal the godliness? Through action. Action mitzvah is charity. As is known to the scholarly, action with reference to divinity is the diffusion and flow of vitality to the lowest depths. So someone who has nothing of his own. Whoever sacrificed, okay, so basically the bottom line is charity, 1800 approximately saying, is the call of the hour in regards to the mystical call of the hour. Because God is the most hidden in the lowest depths of the world of action, of physical. You want to reveal, you got to give actionable mitzvahs. Particularly, charity is the most actionable. It says in the earlier part of Tanya, charity is the most action mitzvah of all the mitzvahs. Why?
Wow.
Because all of the mitzvahs take one limb. Tefillin, heart, head, lulav, you're shaking it, right? There's one part of the body. Charity is your hard-earned money that you used every part of your being to make the money, right? To survive. You could have used the money to you work hard, you work really hard, sweat and tears, you make the money, you could use it to survive. And you're saying, no, I'm going to give it to God, give it to God's purposes, to help people.
Wow.
So it's a more holistic action mitzvah. Right. Exactly. And he ends off saying, whoever sacrifices his impulse in this respect, a fascinating concept, whoever sacrifices his impulse in this respect, sacrifice. He's saying the Alter Rebbe is not foolish and saying, oh, just give your money. He says he knows it's really hard for them. It's bread money for many of them. And he says, if you could simply set like an altar, you go to bring a carbon, you sacrifice. It's no less sacrificial to take the selfish desire to hoard your money, or at least hoard a little bit of money they had, and saying, no, I'm going to give it for a holy purpose. And you open your hand and heart, and therefore, what do you cause when you do that? You're taking the evils, the other evil side of concealment, the klipa, to be subjugated, and you convert the darkness into light of God, blessed be He, who in the time when the footsteps of Mashiach are close upon us, dwells over us in a state of action. Moreover, you will merit to behold eye to eye God return to Zion. And that ends the letter. There's more to the letter. I just found that I was reading the Steinsaltz Tanya, which is much more than the simple translation. The simple translation is pretty straightforward. We're in a part of history where God is hidden in the most lowest depths of the actionable world. The only way you can release that is through corresponding action mitzvahs, charity being the most. 2 points I found interesting in the Steinsaltz Tanya. In general, the Yetzer Hara, evil impulse, it wants to get you to do everything, all the negative stuff, right? However, the Yetzer Hara, you'd say what's the most core psyche or drive of the evil impulse of the animal soul? Selfishness, self-preservation. money, we're very tight to it because it helps us continue to exist. And you can sacrifice that. You're really not going to you're not just giving at the office. You're literally giving the jugular vein, so to speak, of the animal soul's modus operandi, which is selfish. You're saying, I want to be selfish. Bam, I'm not going to be selfish. You're literally you're banishing the darkness and extracting the good.
Wow.
Another a really cool analogy was this idea. To me, it's a very fascinating idea that there's times in history when the Rebbes, in this case, the Alter Rebbe, in our generation, the Rebbe, they put a focus. They shifted Jewish focus, not necessarily saying, "Oh, you could stop learning Torah every waking minute," because the Alter Rebbe's followers learn Torah every waking minute. But they say you cannot suffice with that because the history, the way it's going, which ultimately the history is greater concealment of God, the more we go on till Mashiach comes. And that's not just a negative, it's also a positive. You get to reveal God in the most hidden place. You understand? It's not only like, oh, woe is us. We're in an even lower time than he's talking about. Yes, and you now have the opportunity, us small midgets on the shoulders of giants, to bring a God to places that never existed before. That weren't even an arena in those days. For example, in the atheistic arena of universities, if Chabad's there, right? Like it didn't exist. There wasn't that level of apathy to God and Torah there. And what happens? We're going to bring God there too.
Wow.
It's an example. And that's just on a general level. But in our own lives, right? We struggle with things, mental health, things that like weren't things 150 years ago because there was no. You don't have the luxury of having mental health issues, but now we have them. So we got to deal with them. We got to bring God there too. Another fascinating thing is he gives an analogy. The sun throughout the day is shining. Right. Let's say it starts on this side of the window, and it shines through. But at the end of the day, it's shining the other side, right? The other window, right? It's the way it goes, right? The sun is going there, so it'll shine brightly through this way. But then let's say in the afternoon, it will start shining from that way. And, you'll have some light there, but it won't be the sun shining. So here's a fascinating analogy. In history, God, the sun, is an analogy for God's Shekhinah, God's light. It shines in different arenas. So if let's say you open the window when the sun is not shining, in the afternoon, when it's not shining here, what are you doing essentially? You're bringing a little light in, but are you bringing where the huge opportunity of light is, which is the window over there? You're not doing that. It takes a Rebbe to tell you where are the golden nuggets to be found. I mean, you can use your brain also. I think the Rebbe's not just telling you but in our example, obviously I'm seeing things from my own prism, is the Rebbe told us that the mitzvah of our generation is we have to spread divine awareness and Judaism awareness to our fellow Jews, and on a certain level, to our neighbors, our non-Jewish neighbors, not to become Jewish, but to do their 7 mitzvahs. Again, and that does not take away from you have to study Torah and you have to do all the mitzvahs. It doesn't take away, but the emphasis shifts. The gold nuggets are to be found where the Rebbe tells you to be found.
Sure.
All right.
The Rabbi now.
What?